I'm just enjoying what is a beautiful spring day here in Tassie, weeding this garlic. It's going really nicely because I put compost around this garlic and most of the weeds are very loose in their roots and coming out really well. I haven't weeded it up to now because we have had lots of wet weather and really quite difficult to do this, rather muddy when it's wet. But garlic isn't what I wanted to talk to you about today. I thought you may be interested to look at what I've been doing over the last couple of weeks. I've been working on a little project indoors, a fair bit of it, while the weather hasn't been so good. Now, as I've said before in previous videos, preservation of food is one of the keys to self-sufficiency. First, of course, you do have to produce the food, but that's comparatively easy compared to preservation. Preservation of food is the element that takes quite a bit of work, and people often find it easy to forget about that, and they can produce the food but then they don't preserve it. It goes to waste in some way, and later when they need it they haven't got it. Now, we preserve a lot of food using the Fowler's Vacola method, bottling it or canning it as you might call it in the US, and that's great. But another method that I've always wanted to utilize here is dehydration. Dehydration is something that I have a family history of. My father was a pioneer in drying bananas and setting up that industry, getting it started. And I have made attempts here in the past trying to utilize the sun to dry things. Now, I've done little bits, just put things on the roof, and that works quite well, but it's quite vulnerable to the birds, to other types of insects and so on. And also, sun drying is very dependent on weather. If you've got a beautiful day like today, it works really well. But if it's cloudy and rainy, which is not that infrequent here in Tasmania, particularly the cloud factor, then your food doesn't dry so well and it can spoil. So I did try and build a box solar dehydrator a few years ago, and it didn't really work that well. The issue really is about timing. There are a couple of things that we would dry, like prunes, plums, maybe peaches, which come in January, maybe February, and sun drying is quite feasible at that time. But there's other things like the tomatoes and especially apples and pears, which come later in the season into autumn, and at that time we're getting lots of cloud, temperatures are low, and sun drying really just doesn't work. Now, we dry a small number of apples over our wood heater, but you can only do around about 15 apples at a time doing that, and so it's a fairly slow process. I mean, it takes a couple of days to dry those 15 apples, and so it takes days and days to actually do it. So what I've actually long wanted to do was to build a wood-fired dehydrator, and that's what I've been doing the last couple of weeks. I started by purchasing a barrel fire kit. So that's a kit to actually set up a drum as a fireplace, and they're quite readily available and not that expensive. I chose a oil drum. Better to use an oil drum than a fuel drum, much safer. I wanted to make it a little bit shorter than a standard 44-gallon drum, so I chose to actually cut the middle ring out of the drum at a point where I could actually then overlap it very slightly. While the outside of the drum looked a little bit rusty and not so pleasant, inside, being an oil drum, of course it was perfect. I then put those two halves together using some fire cement and screws. This wasn't really that difficult to do and something that anybody could accomplish. I then fitted the kit to it, so that the legs, the door, and set it up outside to do a test firing. and it really worked quite well. Even with only a small piece of flue on it, it still ran quite well and showed no sign of leaking at all. The other reason that I fired it outside was to dry that fire cement out properly. The next stage, of course, was to fit it into the shed because I wanted it out of the weather in a place that I could work with it. The shed is much better to do this than drying in the house because we can light it in the shed and it doesn't matter. It's not going to be too hot. It's not going to affect temperatures in the house. So having it installed, I then started to work with the old solar dehydrator that I had built to modify that to actually use the wood heat. I added some legs to it and then a skirt around the bottom to actually capture the heat off the drum. So that's the point that I'm up to at this stage. I have been test firing it, but let's go into the shed and have a look at it. So this is the current situation. I've done a number of test firings. Basically what I wanted to achieve by that is to dry out all the paint, get all the odor out of it, and also to work out what sort of temperature range I was able to achieve, how I could manage it. To do that, I've used thermometers inside it and checked temperatures on top and bottom trays. So far it looks as if there is about a 10 to 15 degree by Celsius variation between top and bottom. It's open at the bottom, so the heat is rising up there, and in the top I've put a hole which I can vary the airflow by opening and closing this flap and putting something under it to hold it open. So with it open around about, say a hand like this, so around about 4 inches, it runs quite nicely. I'm finding temperatures of around about 60 degrees Celsius here at the very bottom to around about 40-45 at the top. Now, it does depend on the fire naturally, so there's a bit of management needed in actually getting it right, and it doesn't need a very big fire. I think I could probably, with a bit of experience, get it to only a 10 degree temperature. So you could put fruit in it and halfway through the drying process rotate the top to the bottom, bottom to the top, and dry it reasonably even. Medium temperature of around about 50 degrees Celsius is ideal for dehydrating food. It does depend a little bit on the food as to how moist it is. With something like tomatoes, you need it a little bit hotter. With drier foods, a little bit cooler is better. Now, I should say most of the heat is coming directly from the barrel underneath, but I have the back of this, which is just metal, sitting against the chimney, and that means that there is a reasonable amount of heat actually comes directly through this wall from the chimney, and that helps keep the top of it hotter than it would otherwise be. Now, if I enclose that chimney in some way, I could actually get more heat into it, but I do want to be able to move this away at times when I'm not using it potentially, and just use the fire as a heater for the shed without drying things. So there's a few more things I need to do at this stage. I need to make some more trays. I have a couple more than this, but I need probably another 4 trays. And I just put a piece of flyer mesh on the tray. You can see that there, and that means the fruit can sit on that quite nicely and not fall through. Another thing I will do is to get a couple of these thermometers, which are not very expensive, and fit them through the side here. So the probe will go out towards the center of the dehydrator and get a fairly good reading, and I'll be able to read the temperature here without opening the door. And that'll make it a lot easier to work with, to be able to see the temperature and to adjust it, whether it's to open the flap up here at the top or to put more fire in it or less fire in it. Now, in the actual barrel itself, you'll see that I actually put some bricks in there. I've done that because I wanted to really be able to hold some residual heat. I expect that I would start a load in this in the morning and run it all day, and then last thing at night give it a little bit of a stoke, and as that fire finished, it began to cool down overnight. Those bricks could then hold some heat and still keep it warmer for longer overnight. I don't really plan to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and stoke it. 16 hours or so of firing will be quite adequate, and then come back and start it up again in the morning if necessary. And that would really depend on what I'm drying, because there are some things that you could dry in just that time. Other things would take a little bit longer. Now, you may of course notice that there's some timber on the outside of it. I should say that the inside is all metal, and it's insulated between the timber on the outside and the metal on the inside. From my experience so far, there is no significant heat on the outside here. There might be a little bit coming up from the bottom, but at the moment I'm feeling fairly confident that it is safe. But I will monitor what's happening down at the bottom just to make sure it isn't drying the timber out and there isn't any risk of fire. If that was the case, that it was drying out too much and getting too hot, I would have to make some further modifications. But largely at this stage, apart from firing it still a few more times to really get the odours right out of it, it's simply a matter now of waiting until January, which is still 4 months away, till we have some fruit. Unless, that is, I managed to get hold of a case of ripe bananas or something like that that I could put in and give a trial run with. Anyway, I better get back and finish weeding that garlic now and enjoy some more of that sun while we've got it.